Written by Devil Juice. A few months ago, like many other people in recent times, I found myself needing to search for a new job. Though I had lost my job with my company after a wave of layoffs, I was staying positive and felt optimistic. Though I'd been planning to stay with my company for another year or two at least, I had no intention of staying there long term. I had to move up my career plans a bit, but I had the experience necessary to look like a promising candidate, as well as plenty of promising connections in my field in order to potentially secure a job somewhere else. Nothing 100% concrete, but I was in a good position and quite lucky to be there. I was well aware that I could have ended up much worse off. Though I was relatively secure, I didn't dare let myself languish, for fear of having the carpet pulled out from underneath me when I least expected it. As such, while I was waiting to hear back from my potential connections, I spent some time scouring online job listings for possible leads. Making a point to always be on the lookout for a better offer was something of a mantra of mine. I didn't really expect much of anything to come of it, but who knows, right? Anything to keep me from thinking about being unemployed. I thought I'd feel productive, or at least get something resembling enjoyment out of it. Mostly, I just ended up feeling sad. 3 years of experience minimum for a $15 an hour gig? Who are they kidding with that? Then there were the blatant scam listings. I really hope that no one actually fell for those way too good to be true offers. Though, if the scams didn't work at least some of the time, then I suppose they wouldn't be there, huh? Despite my posturing, I was beginning to come to terms with the fact that this whole exploratory job search was a fruitless venture. It was when this thought occurred to me that I came across a listing that was strange, to say the least. The listing as a whole gave the impression of being written by someone who had no idea how to write or structure a job posting. Sort of like those listings that you see that have clearly been copy-pasted across several sites with little to no care for formatting, but slightly different from that in a way I couldn't seem to adequately describe. The listing was presented in a big block of text, one paragraph with weird spacing and occasionally inappropriate punctuation. The sentence structure was a bit odd to say the least, and rather difficult to read. Something about the way the letters were placed just kept drawing my eyes back to the screen. For a few moments, I just couldn't seem to make any sense of what I was seeing, as if I had suddenly developed a severe case of dyslexia. Then it all snapped back into focus and I was left with a slight headache. After some time examining it, though, I was eventually able to parse some information from the listing that actually sounded quite attractive. They were looking for someone in my field. The salary was reasonably nice, and the benefits package was more or less the same as I'd had at my previous company. Despite the general weirdness of the listing, I was actually seriously considering applying. I did have some misgivings about how the listing seemed, but I found myself justifying and explaining away the odd vibes I was getting. Perhaps this was just another copy-pasted listing, and the weird feelings I got from it were just my stress and anxiety about my future manifesting in an odd way. Or maybe it had been written by someone who had never written an online job posting before. Perhaps an older gentleman who worked for/owned a small but successful company and was looking for a young, savvy business professional to join the team. Well, perhaps not that exact scenario, but either way, it didn't matter much. This position was right up my alley, and it would be foolish to pass up such a great opportunity over a few bad feelings. Without further delay, I filled out some information and sent in my resume. After doing so, I closed out of my job search and shut down my computer, finally feeling like I'd actually accomplished something with my idle scrolling. I thought that applying to that job posting was my way of overcoming my worries, but perhaps I'd simply succumbed to them. I really should have known better than to roll the dice on a potentially sketchy listing, especially since I had so many other potential leads that I was just waiting to hear back from. Joblessness was really weighing down heavy on me though, and I could only spend so much time stagnant, just lazing about my apartment looking for ways to pass the time, before I started to get a little stir-crazy. I needed to do something. I needed to feel productive, like I wasn't just waiting around for the dice to fall and decide my fate. And besides, there wasn't a whole lot anyone could do with the information that I'd given them. And I did no better than to carelessly give them anything else. What harm could come out of just applying? I wouldn't have to wait long to find out, apparently. Not even 2 days after I applied, I received an email about setting up a time for a video interview. No matter how many I'd done before, I always get nervous before an interview, and this time was no different. In fact, it felt a bit worse, given the odd nature of the posting. The email I received had done a lot to ease my concerns, though. It had been quite professionally written, and the sender, a Mr. James Willow, did not request any further personal info or anything else that seemed like a red flag. All the same, though, I still felt a bit uneasy about the whole affair. Perhaps it had something to do with the quick response time, or the contrast between the garbled job posting and the well-written email I received. I wasn't quite sure, but I chose not to dwell on it too much. The appointed time for the interview came, and I clicked the link that I was provided in the email I received. I glanced at the little window I had pulled up that displayed my own camera feed, and adjusted my tie a bit as I waited for the web page to load. Satisfied with my own appearance and lack of anything potentially embarrassing in the background, I returned my full attention to the loading web page, fidgeting a bit in anticipation. The web page finished loading, yet the section of the screen I expected to see my interviewer's video feed in was pitch black. The smaller window displaying my feed was still working, and I didn't get a prompt about connection issues or anything like that. Was it a problem on their end? "Hello?" I hesitantly called out. There were a few moments of silence. Then a sound came from my speakers that vaguely resembled someone fumbling with the receiver of a telephone.
"There we go,"
the voice of an older man replied, his audio tinny and slightly garbled.
"Sorry, I seem to be having some issues with my video. Just 1 sec."
"Of course, sir," I replied, feeling a bit relieved at the familiarity. I'd long grown used to dealing with older coworkers and superiors with a less than ideal grasp on modern technology. A few moments of frustrated grunts and quiet murmurs passed before the voice returned, clearly exasperated.
"Sorry, I can't figure out what's wrong with this thing. I can see you fine, though. So, would it be alright if we went on with the interview like this, Mr. Davidson?"
"That's quite all right with me," I replied in a purposely pleasant tone. "This is Mr. Willow, I presume."
"You presume correctly,"
the voice responded with a slight chuckle. What would follow would be one of the most standard, by-the-books, structured interviews that I'd ever had. I was absolutely delighted. All the questions I was asked were ones I'd expected and prepared for. I spoke clearly, concisely, and without giving in to my nervous stutter. I even managed to sneak a polite, tasteful joke or two in there, which elicited a few genuine chuckles from Mr. Willow. Suffice it to say, I was doing great. Well, for the first half of the interview anyway. I was in the midst of answering a question when a flicker of something on my computer screen caught my eye and distracted me. It was some sort of distortion in the dead video feed from my interviewer's webcam. Was it coming back online? I trailed off a bit, my attention unintentionally shifting to the screen in front of me. There were a few flashes across the little black window of colorful distortions and fractured images. And then, for a few brief seconds, I got a clear view of who was interviewing me. Any trace of remaining focus on the interview flew away like a startled sparrow. There wasn't just one person there interviewing me. There were several. At least 5 that I could see within the frame of the webcam, all tightly huddled around the single screen, though I thought there might be more standing motionless in the background. They were all a variety of ages and genders, but they had a multitude of other features in common. They were all seemingly completely naked, displaying every inch of their other common features. Skin so pale, almost translucent, that one might be convinced that it had never felt the soft kiss of the sun's rays. Their eyes were all shiny marbles of pure, featureless black. With no clear pupil, it was hard to tell for sure, but I felt certain that they were all staring at me. Splattered across their porcelain skin in varying degrees was a glistening, wet substance that I felt certain had to be blood. It was an exact match for the deep crimson light that seemed to emanate from the dim room behind them.
Mr. Davidson, is there something wrong?
The multitude of strange figures asked in unison with the same familiar, friendly voice of an older man. The video feed flickered off once more. "No, nothing's wrong," I replied, stuttering. "Now, where was I?" I rushed through the rest of the interview, giving my practiced answers with the general attitude and demeanor of a startled cat. As soon as the interview ended, I shut down my computer and wandered over to my bathroom, stripping off my suit and tie as I went. For a while, I just sat in my shower with the hot water running, staring at the wall. I'm not entirely sure why I did that. It just felt like the right thing to do, I suppose. I spent my time there figuring out my thoughts on what I was certain I'd seen and how I planned on responding to it all. In retrospect, I probably could have handled the situation better. Even if I had, though, I'm not sure it would have changed much. I made no further attempts to contact Mr. Willow or to follow up on that or any other potential job postings online. When I got the email I had been dreading since the interview, a message from Mr. Willow with a job offer, I not only ignored the message but also made a completely new email account. I know ignoring one's problems hardly does much of anything to solve them, but I figured it would work fine in this situation. It seemed reasonable to think that, lacking any sort of response from me, those odd figures would just move on to a new candidate for their job, or whatever else they have planned for whatever poor, hapless individual happened to accept their offer. I had made a severe oversight, though. I made a point not to share any more personal information than necessary. However, while they didn't have the important info, they didn't have enough info. I was relaxing in my apartment one evening when, all of a sudden, I heard a knocking at my door. It had been several weeks since that interview, and I hadn't thought about it in some time. I'd accepted a job offer from one of my connections, and I was fully preoccupied with getting settled in at my new job and reveling in the sense of safety and security that steady employment brought. My pleasant mood and busy mind didn't keep me from recognizing the strangeness of the situation, though. It was well after 10 p.m. I hadn't ordered food, and I never arranged for visitors that late in the evening. Who could it be? A neighbor? Intrigued, but unconcerned, I wandered over to the front door and took a look through the peephole. I was met by a beady, black eye staring directly back at me. All my breath escaped my lungs in a panicked wheeze as I quickly backed away from the door, stumbling over my own feet and falling on my ass in the process. Even if they hadn't seen me in the peephole, they most definitely knew I was home from the loud thump that resulted from my stumble. It all seemed so obvious in that moment. They had my resume, my full name, my previous workplaces. It would be easy enough to find out where I live. It might have only taken a few Google searches. Why hadn't I seen it coming? It was simple, really. The answer came to me as soon as I asked the question. For whatever reason, even after what I'd seen in the webcam feed, I'd somehow expected the response to be reasonable, of all things. Normalcy had gone out the damn window a long time ago. The knocking continued, at first at a reasonable pace, but then becoming more rapid and heavy, as if multiple people were beating angrily on the door with their fists. I scuttled backwards across the floor until I hit a wall and couldn't go any further, my eyes still fixed on the rattling door. I tried to reassure myself the door would hold. There wasn't any way they were going to get in. It even seemed like that would be the case. That is, until something hit the door with the force of a battering ram, and I saw the wood around the door frame begin to crack and splinter. I snatched up my cell phone and ducked into my bedroom, locking the door behind me and beginning to push any furniture I had in there up against the door. I had just finished getting my bed frame propped against the door alongside my dresser when I heard the front door give out. Lacking any more furniture to pile up against the door, I propped myself up against my makeshift barricade and dialed 911, barely able to press the numbers with my shaking fingers. In the end, I was very lucky that night, if not for several different independent factors that turned out quite favorably for me. Things might have gone a whole lot worse. For one, I lived in an apartment building. I seriously doubt that any of my neighbors there would have intervened in any way on my behalf, but one of them did call the police to make a noise complaint. Because of this individual, they already had an officer on the way by the time I called myself. On that note, on most nights in my city, the police would be far too busy with more urgent calls to check in on a noise complaint until maybe an hour or more after it was reported. I was very lucky that an officer happened to be free enough to check on it immediately. In regards to whoever or whatever had broken into my apartment, I lucked out quite a bit as well. I'm not sure if they were searching for me or just intentionally trashing my apartment, but they spent precious time tearing up my living room and kitchen before making it to where I was hiding. If they had made a beeline for my bedroom instead, judging by how easily they had broken through my much more sturdy front door, I doubted my impromptu barricade would have kept them at bay long enough for the police to get there. By the time the intruders had finally gotten to work on tearing into my bedroom, the cops had already arrived. My unwelcome guests, in contrast to their apparent rabid ferocity, immediately bolted at the sound of sirens. Even so, I didn't dare stick my head out of the bedroom until I heard police calling out for me from inside my apartment. I can look objectively back at the situation now, but sometimes I still find myself shivering when I think about it. I was mere minutes, perhaps even just seconds from... I really don't like to think about it. Unfortunately, though, after that point, things didn't go nearly as well. The police investigation that followed this incident didn't end up doing much to resolve the matter. It's not like I blame the police or anything, though, as they didn't really have much to go on. There were no security cameras in my apartment building to speak of, and the only witnesses had either simply heard a loud banging, or in my case, seen a single eye. Not exactly a whole lot there to help ID a suspect. There was some physical evidence in the form of blood they found here and there throughout my apartment, but that didn't help much either, surprisingly. Rather than assisting them in identifying a suspect, each blood sample they took from the crime scene was, strangely enough, identified as having come from a variety of different animals. It really confused forensics, apparently, as the blood splotches examined at the scene seemed to have clearly come from wounds sustained from broken glass and other jagged pieces of broken furniture laying about the apartment. Of course, I had a very good idea as to who it had been, but I didn't have much luck in trying to prove that as well. By all rights, it should have been easy. I had the job listing and even their contact info. Even if they'd taken down the job posting, I'd taken a screenshot of it weeks ago when I had still been interested in the job. However, when I went to pull up said listing, I ran into a bit of a snag. It was all gibberish, even the screenshot I'd taken. There were some actual words, sure, but none of them were arranged in a way that made any sense. I was lucky that I only got a few odd looks from the officers I tried to show it to, rather than a psychological evaluation. I guess they just assumed I was still stressed from the incident or something. Without trying to show them to any of the officers, I also double-checked our email correspondence and found the messages they had sent me to be just as garbled. In truth, I feel more terrified of this gibberish than I ever was during the break-in. How was I able to look at that mess and interpret it as a job offer? I suppose I could have imagined that somehow, but Where did I get the email address to send my resume in? The link to the video interview? It would be a stretch to claim that I had imagined those. It made far more sense to say that I hadn't imagined it, and the implications of this truth absolutely terrified me. Did those strange creatures have some sort of influence over my mind? I tried to explain all this to the police while attempting to sound as little like an unhinged maniac as possible, but they seemed to have no idea what to make of my story. They might have just dismissed me altogether, if not for one piece of evidence that seemed to support my explanation. Words, carved into my front door, seemingly by the intruders, which read as follows: "Accept the offer." There haven't been any major incidents in the months since the break-in, but that certainly doesn't mean that nothing has been happening. I broke my lease and moved out of that apartment within the week, not wanting to take a chance with staying there a single night more than I had to. I've since moved to a new apartment on the other side of my city. It's nice, sure, but I don't think I'll be staying there much longer either. I'm not sure I feel safe in the area anymore. My friend in the company has been very understanding throughout this whole ordeal, which I'm incredibly grateful for. He's helping me arrange for a transfer out of the city and into one of the company's other office branches. It looks like that transfer should come about easily enough, which gives me some measure of relief. I wish I could hope that those figures had forgotten or given up on me, but I unfortunately know for a fact that they haven't. No matter how many times I switch to a new email, it never fails. Within a few weeks of having the new account, I'll eventually start to receive emails from them again. Vaguely threatening emails, demanding a response and sharing info about my current life and habits that they really should have no way of knowing. Still in the usual gibberish that I'm somehow able to interpret. So far, I've simply been ignoring these messages, but it's only served to increase the frequency of their arrival. I pray that, after the move, this will all just stop, that they'll eventually just get bored of me and move on to some other candidate. That would be the reasonable thing for them to do, of course. However, as far as these people are concerned, I'm not holding my breath.